Kia ora and welcome. My name is Adam Baker. I'm the minister here. It's wonderful to have you with us this evening. So welcome to Mornington Methodist and the Dunedin Methodist Parish. If you've taken part in one of our Gibson memorial talks here before, welcome back. We're glad to have you with us. And if this is your first time here, a particular welcome to you as well. If you have any questions at any point, please don't hesitate to let us know. Either I or someone else from the parish would be happy to offer you guidance or assistance. There is a necessary point of fire safety that I'm required to let you know about. Should the fire alarm sound, hopefully this is a non-issue, but if it does, we have a number of exit doors. There's the two that you likely came in, and one on either side of the back of the sanctuary. One goes outside. There's also a door through the women's toilet down the hall, and just head that direction if you need to. But hopefully, like I said, it won't be an issue at all. Now, for many decades, Colin Gibson, who is a well-known Methodist hymn writer, a vital part of this church, organized monthly educational evening gatherings here at Mornington, and just addressed a wide variety of contemporary issues. And following Colin's death, we've really continued these opportunities for education and for growth. And you who take part in them, these Colin Gibson memorial talks, help to honor his hope for a church that continues to engage the world for Christ. So I'm very grateful that you're here, and it is good to be with you. And before we introduce our speaker for this evening, would you join me in some prayer? Blessed Lord, thank you so much for this opportunity to gather together, to be in this space. Open our minds and our hearts that we might continue to learn and grow. We are grateful for this opportunity. It's in Christ's name that we pray. Amen.
Kia ora koutou. My name's Richard Cannon, and I'm one of the group that organises these talks. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Peter Lineham. Sir Peter is a historian specialising in religious history. He obtained a BA and an MA from the University of Canterbury and a PhD from the University of Sussex in the UK. He's also an alumnus of the University of Otago. He graduated with a Bachelor of Divinity in 1989. Peter is currently an Emeritus Professor of History at Massey University, where he taught for 40 years. Peter's early research focused on 18th and 19th century British Protestant sects, and so is well qualified to talk tonight on Methodism. Peter has been a regular media commentator on religious matters in New Zealand. He has contributed numerous entries to the Dictionary of New Zealand Biography and led its Religion and Church People Working Group for over a decade. In the 2019 New Year's Honours, Peter was appointed a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to religious history and the community. Just a little advert here. Mornington Methodist Church will be celebrating 150 years of Methodism in Mornington in a fortnight's time, with a concert on Friday the 11th of September, a dinner on Saturday the 12th of September, and a celebratory service at 10 a.m. on Sunday the 13th of September. And if you'd like to attend any of those events, then please see me after the talk. As we as a church reflect on where we have come from and what lies ahead, we're particularly pleased that Peter has been able to join us to give the Gibson talk with the title, The Methodist Approach to Church Structure. Please welcome Peter Lineham.
Well, it's my great pleasure to be with you this evening, and especially to honour the memory of Colin Gibson, who, on all my dealings with Colin, which were quite considerable, he was just such a wonderful person, such a delightful person to know. And so it's my pleasure to speak in a lecture named after him. Of course, my computer has just decided to turn itself off, but I probably can find out how to turn it back on relatively simply. Yes, indeed. It could be argued that there is no distinctive Methodist form of the church. John Wesley more or less said as much in 1787 when he was describing how he and his brother founded the movement. I quote, "It may be observed that these clergymen, all this time," he's reflecting back on the very earliest days of Methodism, "had no plan at all. They only went hither and thither wherever they had a prospect of saving souls from death. But when more and more asked, what must I do to be saved, they would decide to meet all together. 12 came the first Thursday night, 40 the next, soon after 100. And they continued to increase till 3 or 4 and 20 years ago, the London Society amounted to 2,800 people. So you can see from this picture the utter pragmatism of Wesley and probably of Methodist polity. But I think this is one of those many issues where Wesley sets out to convey one thing, but you do have to read between the lines to make sense of Wesley, I think. I think perhaps the critical issue was that, remember, in those days, there was such a sharp division between Anglicans and non-Anglican Protestants. And all non-Anglican Protestants knew precisely the scriptural doctrine of what the church should be and could justify the structures that they stood for. And on the Anglican side, you have the beautifully clear reasoning of Richard Hooker, arguing precisely how this church is exactly placed to meet the needs of the people sitting between the extremes of Protestantism on the one hand and of Catholicism on the other. So we have to ask some questions about what Wesley thought he was doing. And I want to focus on these structures simply because what he did end up with is so distinctive. And because the movement started off, remember, in the absolute chaos of a revival with people becoming Christians and people getting extremes and people yelling from the pews and people falling over and all the dramatic events of the early days of the Methodist renewal. And I don't want to minimize that life and that abundant flourishing that took place in that early stage of the movement. But it seems to me that there were plenty of other people involved in the same things, George Whitefield, for example. But only Wesley managed to capture and shape a movement. And I want to bring the story all the way across to New Zealand and even to Dunedin and even for a fraction to Mornington itself to ask whether the structure that he created was resilient and sufficient to do what he wanted to do. Now, I've always been fascinated by the Methodist interest in collecting statistics. And I've used these statistics and challenged these statistics and watched the points where they stopped counting because the figures were going down too fast and all these sorts of things that go on. And I did set to work at one stage of this preparation for this lecture in collecting all the statistics about Dunedin Methodists. And I simply got too exhausted to finish because if you take the online version of the conference yearbooks, I've got a set, but they only start in 1917. It's a set from 1900 online from the conference, from the Methodist Church office. And I can tell you that all these reports will tell you to the last penny the exact expenses of every Methodist parish every year, the contributions made, the amount that the minister was paid, the contributions given by the children at Sunday school, and the proportion taken from each by the conference to keep the fund running. And I can tell you the number of churches, other preaching places, schoolrooms, parsonages in every circuit, and the insurance that they paid for them, the number of ministers, deaconesses, home missionaries, full members, probationary members, junior members, non-Methodist communicants, there was even a tally kept for that, Sunday school teachers, Sunday school students, average attendance at Sunday school, average attendance of the teachers at Sunday school, let alone the same for when it was introduced, the Christian Endeavour classes, the Bible classes, of course divided by gender. And all this comes to light, and the way it's so insistent, it comes to light in this crucial document in understanding Methodism, the Law Book. It's clear that the Law Book lies deeply central to the Methodist experience. Of course, it changes every year a little bit, and I've only got the 1969 edition here. One day I'll manage to add the 1915 edition to my collection, but it's a reminder to me that Methodist churches are the most regulated churches, maybe in the world, with perhaps the single exception of the Salvation Army, where in the case of the Salvation Army, when the itinerant ministers, the officers, moved from one place to another, then a count was done in the kitchen of the numbers of knives, forks, and spoons they had left in plates. Now that is going further than Methodism ever went, even though it was influenced by Methodism. So this leads me to ask about the origins and meaning of this type of Christianity. Now, of course, the central body at the very beginning wasn't actually Methodist. It was the religious society that had been created in the late 17th century, at the age when they were panicking that the world was becoming immoral and they needed to find a way to transform people's moral behaviour. So Anthony Horneck, of Lutheran background, in 1678 began a process to set up the Society for the Reformation of Manners, to organise gentlemen and tradesmen to repress vice by prosecuting the evil members of the community. And then they created the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, and its later branch, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. And these pure, strict High Church Anglicanism sought to bring lay people together to make them more devoted to the church than they had been hitherto. And Samuel Wesley got really caught up in this. This is the father of John Wesley. And so did the formidable Susanna. When he was away, Susanna took control of these groups and gave them a proper exhortation, as you can imagine. And it was actually through these little societies that Wesley was to, in fact, come in contact with the Moravians and gradually be drawn in to find his own distinctive form of Christian faith, because he did work very closely with James Hutton in those societies at Fetter Lane and Aldersgate Street, with 5 or 10 members and a leader. The Moravians called them choirs or bands, and they split them up by age, gender, marital status, etc., to make sure that they could properly address their needs. And rules were created. Members had to confess their sins to each other, answer 11 questions, and make sure they were going ahead in a straightforward and correct manner. Then in 1739, so about a year after Wesley's great spiritual experience, came a breach with the Moravians. And the United Society, perhaps more correctly, the New Society, was formed. Wesley opened the Foundry in Moorfields, a very hastily constructed building in which he sought to gather those people who had begun coming to his societies, and the New Room in Bristol, more or less the same time. There was a series of disputes because when Wesley had made up his mind, he was very fixed that he had to get rid of that Moravian influence, which he saw as thoroughly pernicious, having once been deeply attracted to it. He disputed with some of the members of the Holy Club who were themselves, in a way, formed through their religious societies. And the result was that the Moravians walked out, and what was left became the New Society, or the United Society. So what Wesley was doing was creating a purified evangelical version of an old high church structure, and he was going to make sure it did not go off the rails again. But he also had a problem, having put up these two buildings, in the new room in Bristol and the Foundry. How was he going to pay for them? And it was suggested to him that there was a perfectly logical structure, and that was make everybody every week when they came along to the little meeting to pay a penny. And in that way, he would have a regular source of income that would enable him to pay off the debts. The classes initially actually were visited rather than met, but they later developed into weekly meetings. They were sometimes called, the classes were the ones who were seeking for God, and the bands were the ones who thought that they had arrived and had found God. That was the terminology in those days. So it was a very supervised movement. Now, on top of that, Wesley recognised that those band leaders or society leaders needed themselves to be watched. And so quarterly meetings of the bands were organised, and at them, quarterly tickets were issued to the members of the society, and that would admit them to the society meetings and to the love feasts, where they would sit around tables and eat their bread and water that was part of their celebration. And so it was very easy to deal with problem people. You just didn't give them their ticket, and that solved all issues. As the societies grew larger, each one was appointed with 2 stewards, although the smaller societies would have just 1 steward. And they were responsible also for administering the Poor Fund, which would give relief to poorer members, of whom there were a huge number in early Methodism. The leaders of the bands, of course, Wesley personally selected and regularly purged when he felt that they were not coming up to scratch. The covenant service, introduced in 1754, was intended in this way to celebrate how the structure was creating something new. And the other part, of course, that was very critical was the itinerant preaching. Wesley had from the very beginning drawn around him a group of clergy, Anglican clergy, who shared his vision. He only accepted lay preachers when his mother insisted. He was very reluctant to admit them to come to his 1744 conference, the first conference. But some of them did, including the remarkable Thomas Maxfield. He called them his assistants or his helpers. They were not to be likened to clergy, of course. The assistants, though, were effectively his personal employees. Now, admittedly, at the very beginning, it wasn't quite like that, and this is what worried him. There was John Bennett, and I've read the diaries of John Bennett, who created his own round in Lancashire and Derbyshire and went around from place to place preaching, doing a very similar thing to what Whitefield and Wesley were doing. But then Bennett went ahead and married the woman whom Wesley had rather thought might be suitable for him. And so he was kicked out. And thereafter, it was very clear that strict rules had to be introduced for the itinerant workers. So they were given very precise rules. They were to feed, guide, and teach and govern the people in the societies. They would therefore, when they were coming to the place, and remember they were travelling over huge distances initially, there were 8 rounds for the whole of England. And so they would arrange, I'll be here at 6 a.m. on Friday, so would you all come and gather and I'll preach to you then, and then I'll get on my horse and move on to the next place. And it largely have to be done out of working hours, of course. So these huge circuits, and the itinerant preachers were moved on every 2 months in case they should develop that sort of loyalty that John Bennett had developed. So if you keep moving them around, there's no chance that anybody will get to love them more than John Wesley himself. Now the rounds obviously were far too big and had to be reduced. And also, it was very complex when you have huge rounds like this. The preachers were, in the early days, all single. And so you just had to find them somewhere to board, put them up for that night, and they would be paid not a wage, but a small allowance to cover feeding the horse and the essential necessities of life. So they're assumed to be single men. The moment they get married preachers, of course, it gets much more complicated because clearly the wife is not going to want to itinerate like this. So what will we do? So they tried an experiment of giving an allowance to the wife when her husband was absent so that she'd have something to buy food for the children. But eventually it became clear that you'd have to let the assistants settle down a little bit. So they were left up to 2 years in one place as a base where they would live, but they would still itinerate from that base. Wesley also recognised that there were some people who were very talented preachers but couldn't be expected to itinerate. So he worked out a separate system of recognising local preachers. They were self-funding, expected to have a trade, and expected to be checked off by one of his other assistants that they were kosher. The circuits, as I've said, were following trails of what you might call revival trails of where there was interest. The aim was not to create a parish system that covered everything. It was places where God was doing something. And the great proof of what this was all about lay in the preaching plans. And actually, I've got an old copy of Morley's History, which has a series of preaching plans glued into them. And you may know that plan of the very first plan from the Dunedin area. Do you know the plan? I've got a couple of copies that I might pass around because it's very interesting. This is the plan where Mornington features. You realise you're celebrating your anniversary in the wrong year, because Mornington is right here on this plan from January 1864. So you're a few years late in celebrating. But so there is 2 versions. These are fragile books, but have a look because they're so interesting. So the preaching plans, we know that they were preaching plans from 1760, and they were being printed and handed out to all the local preachers who were on the plan from the 1780s. And eventually the quarterly meeting became very important because that was where the plan would be distributed. And of course, there were other factors in preserving Methodism as well. I mean, you could think of the hymn book. The hymn book itself was a very useful device for creating a sense of loyalty, because that hymn book had the words. Of course, they would mostly, ordinary people probably couldn't read it, but the hymns would be lined out. So the presenter would say one line, then you'd sing it, and it would be done in blocks of lines like that. But gradually, as the corpus of Wesley's hymns grew ever more enormous, printing those hymns became very important. So you can imagine that there's the formalities of Methodism, and remember, this is not a church. They will troop off after their preachings on Sunday morning, if it's a Sunday that they're going to go to the parish church in the hopes that they might be allowed to take communion, but with no guarantees. It varied from time to time. So Wesley's style of government had many very interesting aspects to it. He's often called the apostolic man, and there's a strong sense of incredible affection surrounding Wesley, so much so that, it's described in rather romantic terms in some of the early books. But of course, at the same time, he is a tyrant. Pope John was what he was called by those who did not like him. And Wesley he brought problems upon himself. For example, he was fascinated by people's spiritual experience. There was a group of prophets who appeared in Moorfields in the 1760s, and Wesley was extremely interested. Could it be right? Could it be real? Could these people be actually prophesying from God? And so he goes along and he investigates. But the moment he's decided, of course, out they go, expelled promptly. He doesn't need to consult anybody else because they're his assistants, everybody else. And you realize that the final layer in this structure is the annual conference. And it starts very early, 1744. Recently acquired the Grand Abington edition of Wesley's works, the volume that deals with all the conference proceedings. They're hugely expensive, these volumes, but they're totally fantastic because they're critical editions, which enable us to track down the variants that sometimes come into publication. The conference was important. It gave Wesley the chance to lay down the doctrines of the movement, to codify the rules out of which would come a law book, and thus the publication of minutes was critical because the minutes told you what had been decided. But what was the form of those minutes? Well, it still sort of survives today in the minute. It's a set of questions asked, of course, by Mr. Wesley, in which he very precisely probes his preachers on what they have been up to, how many souls have been converted, how much has been given in the last since he last met them, and so on and so forth. So the conference was the final piece of that impressive structure in which the accountability of the assistants for their circuits was levelled at them. 13 questions were the original questions, but gradually they become more and more extensive. And of course, New Zealand Methodism has added a few extra questions, as has all parts of Methodism. A key function of the conference was to admit new assistants, first as probationers. Nothing so good as a straight-out license. And then at the next conference, if they've gone well, as full assistants. They're subject to cross-examination. If they were in doubt, they were left on trial for an additional year. They were not ordained with the laying on of hands, you understand. That would have caused some upset in England. Was he claiming to be ordaining priests? And as far as Wesley was concerned, he was quite pragmatic about this. He believed it was his right. There was no third layer of clergy above priests and deacons. So when it came to America, he was very happy to act as the presbyter who ordained people for the field in America. But as far as Wesley was concerned, you also were shrewd in the way in which you took your opportunities. Give me 100 preachers who fear nothing but sin and desire nothing but God, and I care not a straw whether they be clergy or lay, as such alone will shake the gates of hell and set up the kingdom of God upon earth. And so this interesting combination also led to the other aspect of the plan, which was stationing. So the critical issue then had to be decided, and initially Wesley had done it himself, but by the late 1740s, it needed to be done in an orderly fashion, so all the preachers had come in. So the stationing meeting became the big event when preachers discovered where they were being sent for the next year. They didn't negotiate, they were told generally. Stationing, of course, remains the critical function of the conference till now. By the time of Wesley's death, you can see that it had built up a system of high responsibilities at every level that held a structure tightly together, and in which obedience to Wesley at the top maintained the structure, which of course raised a problem. Wesley was not going to live forever, and in 1784 he made a curious decision. He had hoped that an Anglican clergyman would be available to take over the movement. None was quite willing to offer on terms that he accepted, and so he chose 100 of his preachers, and they were called the Legal 100, who had the right to run the show once Wesley had died. Of course, the moment Wesley died, it turned out that people who weren't in the 100 felt very bitter about this, and the first split in Methodism followed directly after his death when, led by Alexander Killam, the new connection was set up by those who wanted more say in where they were going to end up. A president was elected at every conference, but of course the other critical side of the story was that you would absolutely need somebody back at Moorgate in Wesley's house, keeping the information. The most important person was probably the book steward, because you needed to publish the rule book, you needed to publish the various documents. And so the book steward became the first of the crucial Wesleyan authorities, or, well, secretarial staff. Property ownership was the other issue. There'd been a few problems in the early stages because enthusiastic Methodists had set up their own purchase, and then one of the trustees had gone AWOL, and for various reasons the property was lost to the connection. And so the model deed was created in 1746, so very early on. And under the model deed, Wesley would have the right to dismiss any of the trustees and to ensure that the building was kept safe for Methodism. And no property could be acquired without using the model deed. And that's a structure, of course, that's still in place today. From the very first, Wesley was insistent that local societies were not independent. Oh, sure, they could do their own keeping of their sets of accounts, but in the end, they had to send all the information through to London so that they'd know precisely what is going on. David Hempton, I must wave David's book, Methodism, Empire of the Spirit, before you. David's a friend of mine, but who ended up at Yale and has written a series of books on Methodism. I quote him from that book: "By devolving responsibility for Methodist fundraising and accounting to the laity," because he created circuit stewards who would keep control of the money, and by insisting that preachers should both itinerate and take their orders from above, the Wesleyan system was a recipe for financial discord. Because it's pulling, you see, in both directions. And laity given certain roles, and preachers are given other roles. You will note, of course, that the system excluded women. Of course, there was a huge level of involvement of women throughout Methodism. The figures would suggest that from the earliest years, it was probably 60% comprised of women, and some of them were allowed to do local preaching. But Wesley made it quite clear that only men would be on any of his trust boards, would be at the conference, etc., until he met the formidable Countess of Huntingdon. But there were doctrinal reasons why she would not be acceptable. So there you are. That's the world of early Methodism. Now let's take a jump across to New Zealand. Unashamedly, Methodism was the most expansive, rapidly growing religious movement in New Zealand in the 19th century. It was of phenomenal growth until 1901. And this was not unparalleled. In almost every part of the English-speaking world, Methodism flourished. The USA, Canada, the West Indies, Africa, Australia, the same phenomenon was observable. Strikingly observable, that where the flag and where the settlers, and let's face it, Methodist settlers were generally drawn from the kinds of people who were likely to be Methodists, people who were on the poorer end of respectable society. Now, of course, before the settlers got here, though, the missionaries were here. And we need to understand, and it's surprising that a lot of Methodist scholarship has not made enough of the missionary society that lay behind the Methodist missionaries. Remember that missionary society, originally there wasn't a Methodist missionary society. The Methodists who wanted to go to overseas missions, other than those in the US, would go to the London Missionary Society, which was comprised of evangelicals of all shades and colours. Then the Anglicans, facing a little bit of trouble from their bishops, that created the Church Missionary Society in 1799. And Wesley looked about, and not Wesley, but the Wesleyans saw that there was a need for their own organisation because they really did not want to be mixing with Calvinists. And so it made a lot of sense to create a Wesley Methodist Missionary Society. And you can quickly see in New Zealand, firstly, there's cooperation. There's a great deal of friendly cooperation with the London Missionary Society missionaries in Samoa and the Cooks. There's friendly cooperation in Paihia with the Church Missionary Society and the agreement that the Wesleyans will take the West Coast and the CMS will take the East Coast of New Zealand. The North Island, of course, I'm talking about, and the South Island. Church Missionary Society didn't really make it there, and so it was pretty much a Wesleyan area. But, and there is clearly a but, when Bishop Selwyn arrived and regarded as his clear responsibility to stop this ragtag of casual churchmanship, and began insisting that the Church Missionary Society had to take orders from him, then there was bound to be a run-in with the Wesleyan missionaries, and indeed there was in 1842-43, when very sharp words were spoken, when Selwyn contended that he had no reason to recognise baptisms by Methodist missionaries because, as far as they were concerned, they were lay people, and lay people could only baptise in cases of emergency, and this was not a case of emergency, so they should have come to see him. And you can imagine that the Wesleyan missionaries prickled with fury at this kind of approach. So the Wesleyan Missionary Society, the other thing that's extremely interesting is that, the Missionary Society proved to be incredibly successful with ordinary Methodists back in England. They loved the stories that they were reading of Methodism growing, and New Zealand stories were very, very popular. It's said, though I'm not completely sure of the truth of this, that in that original site where Methodism set itself up north of the Bay of Islands in Whangaroa, that there's been a suggestion that under the ground, when they had to flee from the place, there was an enormous number of nails found under the ground. And one possibility is that, in fact, small donations, and that nails was the sort of thing that was used as a trading item. But that possibly was one of the factors, we don't know, but one of the factors that made Māori angry at Wesleyans, because they knew they had stacks of nails and were begrudgingly giving them out. But as far as the Wesleyans were concerned, you'd have to account for every nail back to the Missionary Society in London. So you'd want to not overdo it. Now, a split in Methodism in the 1850s meant that the missionary society's income more or less collapsed. And in crisis, they sent the Reverend Robert Young out to New Zealand and Australia in 1853-54, and to see what they could do because they had to cut the costs of the missionary society. And so they came up with the idea that gradually they would turn Australia and New Zealand into an independent connection. Initially, there were subsidies of £7,000 a year, but that they were to diminish. Walter Lawry was ordered to run the operation. He was running the operation here in New Zealand, was ordered to keep a very careful watch and to save money wherever he could. And you can imagine that other missionaries just hated Walter Lawry because they hated being answerable to an accounting system. Again, you have this tension between the lay stewarding and the tight regulation compared with the sense of missionary opportunity. There is, remember, in Methodism a certain potential to be ferocious against the enemy as well as embracing of those who are loved. Mind you, they had met a fair bit of that from the Anglicans, so you can understand their attitude. So the settler churches, as they emerged, at the first, two very intriguing things. One was that inevitably on the boatloads of settlers with the New Zealand Company, there were quite a number of local preachers. Even in surprising places like Christchurch, where there were supposedly pure Anglican settlements, didn't prove to be the case. Then the other aspect that is quite intriguing, well, there's a lot of aspects that are quite intriguing, is that, in the structure of the church, in this tight regulation, the missionaries who had come with a calling to preach to Māori, but were now facing the fact of loss of support, began to also go to the Pakeha, the new little towns, Dunedin, Wellington, Auckland. And that is very different from the Church Missionary Society missionaries who, Selwyn didn't want these low churchmen going out preaching to the congregations he was establishing up and down the country. And so a very different style, which was to mean that, for example, the Wesleyan missionaries were going to be caught with divided loyalties. I mean, it's a tricky situation, which was faced, on one or two terrible occasions. When is the missionary loyal to Māori, or is the missionary loyal to the settlers? And at least one missionary lost their life over that very issue. And it's interesting watching the figures and the way in which rapidly the congregations of Pakeha grow enormously. In 1855, 64 native chapels, 121 native preaching places, 3,070 members, and 7,590 attendees. That's the Māori figures. And the European figures, 19 chapels, 21 other preaching places, 508 members, 2,514 attendees, and the 19 missionaries are shared up between the two, of course. Well, introduce the land wars, and the balance radically shifts. By the time of 1874, when the first local conference was established in New Zealand, there were 51 missionaries, 5 native ministers, 4 catechists for the Māori, 168 English preachers. The number of Māori lay preachers had dropped from 134 to just 27. So the Pakeha churches come to establish their presence, and very quickly, choosing their ground quite carefully, they establish a very strong presence. When the first New Zealand conference was held in Durham Street in Christchurch in 1874, that magnificent building that had been erected just in time for the visit of William Taylor, the American missionary evangelist, who spoke at the opening sessions of Durham Street, and not quite the opening session of the Pitt Street Chapel in Auckland, but these huge chapels he filled full, and with many dramatic scenes going on at them. But what was emerging is clearly a religious movement that affects and touches the early settlers significantly. But what they haven't got is organisation yet. And remember, to be a Methodist, you have to have organisation. So what had been set up by the British Conference was that there would be an Australasian conference. And the Australasian conference would then have what we would now call state conferences, which would include New Zealand on the side. Now, the Central Conference would have responsibility for the crucial areas. Initially, it did handle placing, stationing, though that was later moved, and the handling of all the money of the debts was seen centrally. But the local conferences would have a lot of sort of local arrangements. And in New Zealand, they established initially 4 districts, later quickly expanded to 6. So remember that the penny from the class meeting had been the source of the funds. But by the time that the Australasian conference was going, Methodists had become pretty slack about going to the class meetings. The rule was kept, you had to be enrolled in a class meeting, but nobody kept attendance records anymore as to who was actually going to the class meeting. And there was a lot of debate in the Australasian Conference about this. Class leaders were still reported in the records right until I think the 1920s, by which there was in Dunedin, I think, only one class leader for the whole of the Dunedin circuits. But as Hempton comments, the delicious simplicity of the old Methodist plan, combining as it did piety and payment, commitment and contributions, savings and sanctification, had one fatal flaw. It simply could not be made to work. Rather a big flaw. In 1890, finally, in Britain, and the Australasians copied quickly the same pattern, the obligation to be enrolled in a class meeting was lifted, and instead they simply had to go on a communicant role, and that was seen as being a Methodist. They had debated the issue for 5 days at the conference that was held in Australasia about these matters. It was an important change. People said, that's Methodism losing its spirituality. But more importantly, it was Methodism losing its basis to fund itself. Lower penny had far from ceased to be satisfactory. How were they going to do it? Well, seat rents was the major method. So they rented the seats by the year, and the advantage of that is you didn't have to be a member to rent a seat. And really squeezing money out of everybody was essential, because you understand that the difficulty was enthusiasm led to the building of chapels. You'd borrow money from wherever you could, and the result would be a debt that could drive the whole connection into crisis. The interest bill in 1890 was £2,092 a year. That's a very heavy amount when your total income is £15,000. So issues of servicing the debt were very important. The pastoral link between congregation and pastor was of little interest, you realise, in this structure. The only thing was that if the laity got somebody they didn't like, they might stop giving. So there was a delicate issue, and a lot of the issue hinged on 2 connected questions. One was the 3-year rule. It had risen from 2 years to 3 years was the maximum time you could stay in a parish. And so that was an issue. And secondly, the fact was that the conference, especially the stationing session of conference, was strictly the ministers. So no laity were allowed to take part in that meeting in the Wesleyan system. As you'll hear in a moment, it's quite different for the primitive Methodists. And so the bitterness about this was phenomenal. And there was an extraordinary moment in Dunedin which illustrates the story. The brilliant preacher, Alfred Robertson Fitchett, had been minister of Trinity, of the Trinity congregation back from 1866 to 1868. And then after his 3 years, he became actually editor of the Christian Observer, the first magazine of Methodists. But then he was placed at the same time, and he was in Christchurch where all the head office was developing. And so he was at Durham Street as well. And then he'd always loved Dunedin, and he came back in 1876, and the 3 years ticked by, And when he came up for stationing at the conference, he was not to be found. He'd visited the Bishop of Dunedin and become an Anglican priest, and went on minister for 50 years of All Saints, and then the first Dean of St. Paul's, and of course his son became, third or fourth Bishop of Dunedin. So you can see that these are very delicate issues that you have to get right, and the huge debate, we've got to make that period longer, and we've got to somehow include the laity more in the conference. So after very, very tense debates, the concession was made that the laity could attend the conference and might have some ability to make an input into the selection of the stationing, although the stationing meeting, the pastoral meeting, was uniquely still belonging to the preachers. So a lot of these structures tell you that this tight structure was struggling with the fact that in New Zealand, congregations had to be attracted. There were plenty of options that they could face. Now, because I'm taking far too long on this lecture, I will skip a few pages and point out that in the stationing list, there's an interesting preface that was put in the 19th century station list. Each of the places mentioned in the stations, I'm quoting, and numbering consecutively 1 to 125, is the head of a circuit or mission, and the minister first named is the superintendent. So the superintendent now plays a very important role in keeping control of the other ministers. The superintendent and other minister or ministers stationed in or appointed to the several circuits or missions is or are appointed by the conference to preach and perform all acts of religious worship and Methodist discipline in each and every one of the Methodist churches already erected or to be erected in each circuit respectively within the space of 12 months at such time or times and in such manner as to him or them shall be deemed appropriate, subject nevertheless to the superintendent minister. You get the message? The ministers are the people with the authority. But on the other hand, you've got the circuit stewards who are trying to manage the show and keep the building opened and keeping it cleaned and responsible for the management of the trusts that they have to report back to Christchurch that they're paying their share of the debts faced by the conference. And of course, the other looming factor is the huge power that resides in the head office. And that becomes quite critical. After all, this had been the big issue that had led to the explosion in English Methodism in 1850. The Wesley Missionary Society was ruled over by its secretary, Jabez Bunting, and he was also the book steward. By combining these two roles, he in effect controlled the running of the conference and kept up an enormous correspondence, watching everything, quickly repressing any signs of too great an enthusiasm, quickly making sure that proper order was kept, negotiating carefully with other denominations. He was brought down in a furious burst of animosity against him by the Methodist Reform Association and the so-called fly sheets, which circulated scurrilous rumours, unfair rumours, of course, about Jabez Bunting. And that had a massive effect. Now, in New Zealand, the equivalent figure was William Morley. And Morley's wonderful book, you've seen the Morley's 1900 history of Methodism, because you see, he visited every circuit in the country and every Māori part of the country, took his photographs and put them together, published them in the Wesleyan Methodist magazine, and then compiled them together into this glorious book, which is surely one of the treasures of New Zealand publishing. But you can see that he wielded immense power. He was lured to Australia in 1902. They needed somebody with that degree of management. But subsequent secretaries, the great Rugby Pratt, for example, similarly amazingly competent, who was also the person who could be the historian of the movement, as long as as well as the person who kept the movement in line. Well, let's jump across just for a moment to the ways in which this affects Dunedin. What I think we can see is, remember, firstly, that the missionaries to Māori at Waikuiti and at Otaku are the ones who come in to meet the ships of supposed Presbyterians, but including a few Wesleyans, in 1847, 1848. And they're there, and they try to establish some Methodist preaching, don't find a terribly warm welcome to themselves, but they do manage to keep something going until an Anglican minister is appointed, and then they're certainly not welcomed by the Anglicans either. And then it's the gold rushes that bring Harding in with his incredible desire to reach these people from so many parts of the world who'd come to Otago. And that leads to the creation of the circuit base here in Dunedin, of that huge circuit that was created through the gold mining districts. He's not very popular back in Dunedin because he's away too much, and they feel as though he's not looking after them as they would like to be looked after. And it's only as gradually they're able to appoint separate people to and break up the one big circuit into something smaller that it works. But he wonderfully illustrates what David Hempton talks about American Methodist missionaries. Methodist missionaries were entrepreneurial and pragmatic, opportunistic and optimistic, flexible and adaptable. And that was the secret that enabled Methodism to grow so rapidly. But of course, it is very striking that unlike those great Methodist temples in Durham Street, they sadly lost Durham Street building, or Wesley Methodist in Wellington, or Pitt Street in Auckland, there was no great Methodist building. Trinity was important, but it didn't nearly capture the vision that those great churches did, because for obvious reasons, there was only a relatively small group of people who were loyal Methodists. They were mostly found from people who had come along with other settlers, and others were attracted by some aspects of Dunedin Presbyterianism that weren't terribly attractive, of course. But they weren't just Wesleyans here. Remember, you've also got two other groups of Methodists active. You have the primitive Methodists, who are here 1876, I think, in which in 1876 they create the first circuit, and then a second circuit is created. And remember that primitive Methodists, commonly called ranters, people who are people of loud amens and hallelujahs, are people whose music is a lot simpler than Wesley's hymns and with their theology. They're very much simplistic, saved and rejoicing, and then in deep despond, the distinctive sort of tropes of Methodist literature. So that's one group of people that appealed to the significant working class that was growing in Dunedin. And the other group was also really quite an interesting group, the Bible Christians, who established the Central Mission. That remarkable figure, William Reddy, born in London, son of an Irish monumental mason and a laundress, who had been a boy in George Muller's homes in Bristol, and had become a local preacher in a Bible Christian circuit. The Bible Christians had broken away from Wesleyan Methodists in Cornwall, and the whole closeness of Cornish society was expressed in that Bible Christian movement, which had little time for the rest of Methodism, but was also disliked this distinction between lay and clergy. And so the phenomenal achievements of the Central Mission were achieved by a marvelously entrepreneurial preacher and carer for the world, if you like, in William Reddy. Now, in 1896, the Bible Christians and another group which don't come to Dunedin, the United Free Methodists, who had been some of the people who had broken away in the 1850s, were amalgamated into the Wesleyans. But it's not until 1913 that the Primitives agreed to combine with the Wesleyans at the very point when at last, having fought for years for this, Methodists in New Zealand are allowed to be set free of the burden of Australia. And they really resented Australia because the Wesleyan Methodists of New Zealand were much more freewheeling than the Australians. It's interesting thinking of that today, but it's repeatedly said that they are the ones who want to abandon the class meetings, they are the ones who want to abandon the 3-year rule, and they are constantly irritated by the annoying proprieties of their Australian colleagues. Well, after Union, you can see that the problem is that they end up with just too many chapels in Dunedin for a relatively small population. 8 circuits and, well, I think it was 40 preaching places, 40 Sunday schools. I mean, it's a phenomenal achievement, but who is going to keep all these going? And I was very delighted when I was shown that plan from 1945. It's still large in 1945, although Mosgill's been included in, and so in some ways they're consolidating back. And that process of, well, the difficult thing is, Methodism was made for growth. It doesn't quite know what to do in contraction. Mind you, what denomination does know what to do in times of contraction? These are difficult situations. You will know the stories of the way in which the burden of buildings becomes an incredible pressure in a declining place where you make decisions because of which buildings you need to get rid of, you can't afford to repair, rather than which are the strategic places. And all of these issues create, well, Dunedin Methodism becomes a fascinating glimpse of, the world, because it happened earlier in Dunedin than in most other places, because of the huge numbers in the north of Pacific Islanders who make a difference. Well, conclusion. After all that, Albert Outler, the great American Methodist scholar, set out to analyse what Methodism was, and he said that at heart of Methodism were scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. I bet most of you know that by heart if you're Methodists. But I don't think that's adequate at all, because I think the structure lies at the very heart of Methodism. Remember the rough Anglican equivalent, the so-called Lambeth Quadrilateral, has creeds, sacraments, scripture, and episcopacy. And I think structure is roughly the equivalent of episcopacy, except it's much more embracing in the Methodist case. And if that is the way in which the structures work, if Methodism is unusually centralised and yet needs to retain dynamism, you can see the history of Methodism is the struggle of how to retain the dynamism, but not let the whole thing fly apart in disintegration, and the risk that in the process of keeping it tidy, you destroy the life. That's my analysis of the structure of Methodism. Yep, of course.
I've got a microphone that will allow questions to be heard. Anyone?
Hello, Peter. As you talked, I realised I'm a descendant of ranters, Bible Christians,
Okay.
Wesleyans, evangelicals. And my question is, how do you explain why this is important? Why was it so important and absorbing to people at the time? And are there any comparisons you can make with young people today? Do get caught up in enthusiasms, but is there anything that you could compare this with that they would understand?
Oh, well, I mean, I think it's a most extraordinary story when you look at the outbreak of the Kingswood revival. And this is the astonishing impact where Whitfield and Wesley are working together in the very early stages. And thousands upon thousands of people from the very poorest parts of society are climbing trees to hear the preachers, and dramatic scenes are recorded. And within a year, to Wesley's horror, there's nothing left. You know, the whole thing has just evaporated. And he realizes at that point the reason why it's evaporated is there was no way to build from experience into something that would last. Now, I think that's pretty true of young people today. You know, they can get on. I can hardly young enough to know what it's like to be a young person today, but it seems to me that enthusiasm regularly in people's experience, you have a burst of it, but unless it's shaped and formed, it doesn't last. And I think that's the challenge that all of us face today, how to shape in a contemporary world where it's unlikely that congregations are the way you'll shape it. Maybe you need an app that will do it.
I wonder if you could just give us just a thumbnail sketch of the Moravians.
Oh, yes.
I mean, I've been aware of that, but just putting it in that context, just very briefly.
I would be delighted. I've sat in the Moravian Church House reading documents a lot of time on my sabbaticals in England. So the Moravians were a strange creation that had come about from the work of Huss in Bohemia. And the Hussites, once they'd been driven out of Bohemia, initially, of course, they conquered Bohemia, but then there was an alliance against them, and many of them fled, and they divided into several groups. And one group became kind of secret believers in a Catholic part of Moravia. And then the most extraordinary Count Nikolai von Zinzendorf, a Lutheran count, had this, he discovered about them, and he decided to adopt them, invited them to his estate in Herrenhut. And so they were smuggled across the border into the Lutheran territory, and he permitted them to practice the ancient forms, so far as they remembered them, of their Hussite piety. He also got himself elected as the new bishop, which was a little bit surprising, and of the Moravians. And he has quite a significant role in developing this distinctive form of piety, which is intense, zealous love of Jesus, which is expressed in, well, manners that we would find slightly embarrassing. You know, it's gushing kind of spirituality, which is florid and sexual, quite overtly sexual in the language that it uses about the relationship with Jesus. And Wesley is initially fascinated. He visits them in Bethlehem and Herrenhut, and they are embarking on this great venture to convert the world. And so they've gone across to America, and they're on the ship when he's coming back with his tail between his legs. And the difficulty with Moravian spirituality, sure, it was a very deep evangelical devotion, But it then went into a phase in 1739 in which they adopted the attitude that until you had assurance, you could do nothing. And so this sense of quiet introspection where you couldn't take communion, you couldn't preach, you should say nothing until the assurance came upon you. Now, this was absolutely the opposite of Wesley's good English, pragmatic, empirical approach to life, in which he said, well, but the communion table is an evangelizing ordinance. You meet the Lord when you come to communion. You keep up the habits of prayer and Bible reading, and eventually you'll catch the trick of it. And so it's over that's the heart of the ferocious dispute. And I suppose their spiritualities were different anyway. But Wesleyanism could have ended up with quite a different structure if it had not been for that Spangenberg's work.
Peter, thank you. Why do you think that liberal Methodist churches today are not growing?
I think because they struggle with the issue of personal experience. It's a tricky thing, isn't it? That, if you like, the tensions between Enlightenment is a funny thing because the Enlightenment is based. Wesley was both very enlightened and very intensely experientially focused. He managed to put the two together. I think today that combination is very, very hard to combine. And the difficulty is we need both.
Exhausted the questions, have we? I was wondering, you talked quite a lot about the need for flexibility within Methodists, and I was just wondering, where do we need to be flexible today? Where is the focus that should be coming?
Well, it interests me that in 1975, Dunedin Methodists went back to a single circuit. For years and years, Mornington, for example, had been a circuit with just one minister and no other churches associated with it. Was it 20 years or something like that it had been like that? And the thing is, you need to get some leverage off something bigger. The heart of Methodism requires interrelationship. I think the future lies in finding leverage in more creative ways. But I don't know how to solve the problems of Methodism. I have enough problem in my own church. But, yes.
Okay, well, we might. Oh, George?
Peter, when you were talking about the Hussites, and I suppose it includes the Zwinglyites and various others that floated around in Europe at that time, it makes the definition of them under the Protestant banner terribly broad, because they only get to be that by the fact that they were anti-Catholic. But then they're totally different entities. So I take it there was something quite special that was seen in the Moravians, but may not have lasted with them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing in all of these movements was intense love of Scripture, I think, for a start. And when you see in Wesley too, this fascination with the powerful figure of Jesus, and the desire to learn and know more. I mean, you can never lose from Wesley that desperate desire that people had to know more and more. So he's always issuing books to his preachers and teaching them how to read while riding the saddle. A very foolish idea, I think. And so, I mean, I think all those features from the early printing of scriptures And in the Hussites' case, they didn't print because it was before printing had been found, but they were circulating texts of scripture that Huss had prepared. And so Protestantism, yes, it was an alliance of various different trends, but there were some very strong common elements, more so than, I mean, in later years, Anglicans would sort of declare themselves as somewhere between Protestant and Catholic, but that's nonsense at the time. I mean, they're pure Calvinist Protestants, actually.
If I can just ask, when you found All Saints a rather strange place, because the Anglican Catholic father was Harrison.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
It was suspended. It was called a high Anglican
Yes,
church,
indeed. Yes.
whereas the rest were viewed as rather lower Anglican churches. So it would have been a step towards Catholicism
Yes.
in a way.
Yes, but remember, that's the 20th century. There'd been high Anglicans, and John Wesley's background was high Anglican. And that simply meant that the low Anglicans actually regarded the church as the religious aspect of the people, whereas the high Anglicans regarded the church as God's chosen people, and you had to know its tradition, its shape. Those are the old high Anglicans. Of course, the whole thing shifts very significantly with the Puseyites and the Oxford movement in the 1830s and 40s. And thereafter, once those that don't go to Rome make up for it by overindulgence in ceremonies that were of no great interest. For example, Selwyn did not wear fancy vestments. He was an old high Anglican. He accepted the rule, no candles on the altar, for example, and things like that. Bells and smells were far from what Selwyn would put up with. But later parts of high Anglicanism, the ritual became an end in itself.
Probably didn't angle that question properly to begin with. So can I pick up on what you've said about the passion for knowledge? Is that something that's explicable to people today? Because that's the thing. How do you explain to young people why their ancestors were so desperately keen on religion?
Yeah, it's interesting. I do on BFM, which is the student radio station in Auckland, every Monday at 5:30. For 25 years, I've been interviewed with my own theme tune called "That's the Spirit," and by a whole range of people. It was originally Mikey, what was Mikey? Later a famous radio host, but he began on student radio. And these students, just for 20 minutes or so, I suggest a topic, and they give me a barrage of questions about what on earth does this mean. I think a lot of young people don't understand remotely anything about religion, but they're not uninterested. They're intensely interested, I think. I don't know how we capture that interest.
Well, Peter, don't sit down. You're going to be the focus of this. This is a small gift from us for you presenting tonight. And from the Gibson Talk Series 3 to you, we issue you our thanks.
Yes.